If you're 60 years old right now, the typical Australian in your position has a net worth of $1,601,000. That number comes straight from the Bureau of Statistics, and if you read it and felt a small wave of relief, you're not the only one. Here's the part nobody puts on the graph. Of that $1,601,000, roughly $977,000 is sitting inside the walls of a house. Bricks, a paid-off mortgage, a garden you've spent 20 years getting right, money you can walk through every day and can't spend at the checkout. The financial industry loves quoting that headline net worth number because it makes the country look wealthy. For someone 5 years out from retirement, it's closer to a vanity figure. It doesn't cover a council rates notice. It doesn't pay for a flight to see the grandkids in Perth. So today we're opening up that $977,000 gap. We'll show you why the median Australian is house rich and cash poor, and the specific way people are turning some of that trapped equity into spendable income without being forced to sell the family home. Before we get to where you actually sit against the averages, you need one number the industry rarely puts front and center. Not your total net worth. Your liquid net worth, the part that's actually available to fund the next 20 years. I've watched people turn 60 feeling proud of the number on their bank app, then quietly worry a few years later once they realize how little of it they can actually touch. That's not a personal failure. That's how the system is built to look. If you're in that 55 to 65 window and you're tired of advice that treats a $1,200,000 house and a $200,000 super balance as the same kind of wealth, hit subscribe. On this channel, we talk about spendable income, not paper wealth. The median net worth for Australians aged 60 to 64 sits at $1,601,000. But strip out the family home, and the median liquid wealth, that's super plus savings minus any remaining mortgage, comes in at just $624,000. That's less than half. And it's the number that actually decides whether you can retire on your own terms, not the number that shows up in a wealth headline. Call this the identity protection line. Most people don't identify as doing okay or struggling. They identify as the value of their house. When your home in Sydney or Melbourne is worth $1,200,000, it's easy to feel wealthy, even while your super balance sits at $250,000 and covers a fraction of what you actually spend each year. This is the mechanism behind it. Total net worth for that 60 to 64 group is $1,601,000. Of that, the primary residence accounts for around $977,000, close to 61% of everything you own. What's left, actually accessible and spendable, is that $624,000 in super, cash, and shares. The Bureau of Statistics has tracked this pattern for years in its household wealth data. Property makes up the largest single share of assets for the 55 to 64 age group, larger than super, larger than shares, larger than cash combined. That matters to you because it means the average Australian you're being compared to is, structurally, someone whose wealth sits in a form they can't spend without selling or borrowing against it. Why does the gap sit this wide in the first place? Most people in this age bracket spent their working decades paying off a mortgage, not building a separate share portfolio, and superannuation only became compulsory and meaningful partway through their careers. The house grew in value largely on its own, through the property market, while super grew slower and started later. Nobody sat down and chose to be house heavy. It's simply where the incentives pointed for 30 years. I used to tell people the only number that mattered was the one at the bottom of the balance sheet, the big total. I was wrong about that. I've seen people with net worths above $2 million who were stressed about paying their electricity bill because $1,800,000 of it was a 4-bedroom house they had no intention of leaving. The long-term cost of ignoring this gap is quiet. It doesn't show up as a crisis at 60. It shows up around 75. When the cash runs low, the electricity bill still arrives every quarter, and the only lever left is the one you didn't want to pull. So what happens once you hit 67 and the pension enters the picture? The data shows net worth actually starts to fall, and for a lot of people that drop isn't a disaster. It's a strategy working exactly as intended. Median net worth actually falls as people move through their late 60s and early 70s. It sits at $1,601,000 for the 60 to 64 group and drops to $1,509,000 by the time people reach 70 to 74. Most people see a falling number and assume something has gone wrong, that they're running out of money faster than planned. For a good number of retirees, the opposite is true. The fall is deliberate. Here's why. The age pension assets test only counts what Services Australia calls your assessable assets, and it exempts the home completely. From 1st July 2026, a single homeowner qualifies for the full pension if their assessable assets sit under $333,000. Go above that, and the pension reduces on a sliding scale. Say a retiree has $450,000 sitting in super. That extra $117,000 above the threshold reduces their pension payment. Some retirees respond by gifting money within the allowed limits or by directing extra contributions into a younger spouse's super account, both ways of bringing their own assessable assets closer to that $333,000 line. Done properly, it can unlock close to $31,223 a year in guaranteed indexed income for a single homeowner. That's the trade-off underneath this whole idea. You're giving up a slightly larger private balance in exchange for a government income stream that doesn't run out and doesn't depend on how the ASX 200 performs that year. The invisible cost, if you get it wrong, is losing pension eligibility you didn't realize you were close to, simply because nobody explained where the line actually sat. This isn't about chasing every dollar of pension. It's about understanding that a falling net worth number in your late 60s can be evidence of a plan working, not a plan failing. There's a second piece worth knowing. Financial assets like super and savings aren't just counted for the assets test, they're also deemed to earn a set rate of income under the income test, currently 25% on the first $64,200 for a single person and 3.25% above that, regardless of what your investments actually return. That's part of why the exact mix between home equity and financial assets changes your pension outcome so much, even when your total net worth looks identical to your neighbours. So if the median is $1,601,000, where do you actually sit against everyone else your age? Let's break down where the 55 to 65 group really lands in 2026. Let's put real numbers next to the averages so you can see where you actually sit. Among Australians aged 55 to 64, the top 10% are sitting on net worth well above $3 million, mostly a mix of investment property and larger super balances. The median group holds that $1,601,000 we've already talked about, and the bottom 25% are sitting under $500,000 in total net worth, home included. Those three numbers tell three different stories, but almost nobody watching this fits neatly into just one of them. Plenty of people sit above the median on paper while feeling closer to that bottom bracket in their day-to-day spending, simply because so much of what they own is locked into bricks rather than a bank account. If you landed somewhere in the middle when you heard that, sit with this next part. Meet Gary and Sue, 61 years old, married, living in a fairly ordinary suburb. Their home is worth $800,000 paid off years ago. Between them, they've got $300,000 sitting in super. Add it up, and their net worth is $1,100,000, comfortably above the national median. On paper, Gary and Sue are doing better than most people their age. In their kitchen, they're worried. A $300,000 super balance, drawn down at a sensible 5% a year, produces around $15,000 in income. The ASFA Comfortable Standard says a couple needs about $77,375 a year to live comfortably in retirement. Gary and Sue are short by roughly $62,000 a year, and no amount of looking at their total net worth figure changes that math. Ask yourself the same question Gary and Sue are quietly asking each other. If the super income stopped covering the basics next year, what would actually give? For most couples in this position, the honest answer is that they'd start drawing down savings faster than planned, or cut back on the parts of retirement they were actually looking forward to. The trip to see the grandkids, the small things that make the decades after work feel worth it. This is the exact trap the headline number creates. It tells Gary and Sue they're above average, while their bank balance tells them something closer to the truth, that they're rich on paper and stretched at the checkout. If any part of that sounds like your own kitchen table conversation, that's not a sign you've done something wrong. It's a sign the number everyone quotes was never built to measure what you're actually worried about. Hit subscribe if you want the roadmap for turning a Gary and Sue style net worth into something you can actually spend. Gary and Sue have a choice sitting in front of them, and it isn't as narrow as it looks. One option is to sell the family home they've lived in for decades and start again somewhere smaller. The other is a lever most people their age have never heard explained properly, something we're calling the modern downsize. Picture two versions of Gary and Sue 5 years from now. In the fragility version, nothing changes. They keep drawing 5% from that $300,000 super balance. Their $15,000 a year stays flat, and by around age 72, the super account is close to empty. From there, they're living on a full-age pension alone, which means a genuinely frugal lifestyle, not the retirement either of them pictured. In the resilience version, they use two levers most people never look into. The first is the Downsizer contribution, which lets someone over 55 put up to $300,000 each into super from the proceeds of selling a home, without it counting against the usual contribution caps. The second, for people who want to stay in their home, is the Home Equity Access Scheme run through Services Australia. The Home Equity Access Scheme lets you draw an income stream against the value of your home at an interest rate of 3.95%, well under what a commercial reverse mortgage charges. The payments aren't taxed, and you keep living in the house. The loan and its interest are simply repaid later, usually when the home is eventually sold. Now the mini-math. Gary and Sue use the scheme to draw an extra $15,000 a year on top of their super income. Their spendable income effectively doubles from $15,000 to $30,000, while their net worth only falls by the amount they've drawn, plus interest. Nowhere near the full value of the home. That's a very different shape of retirement to the fragility path. And it comes from using the house as a tool instead of treating it as untouchable. Their net worth on paper looks slightly lower each year under this approach. Their actual lifestyle, the one that pays the strata levy and the car re-Joe without a second thought, is considerably stronger. But every plan like this assumes fairly normal conditions along the way. What happens to Gary and Sue if the market drops hard in the exact year they retire, right when they can least afford to sell anything at a loss? Let's stress test that. Now stack a genuinely rough year on top of all this. Insurance, council rates, and groceries jump by around 4% in a single year, while the ASX 200 sits flat, going nowhere. For the median Australian holding that $624,000 in liquid wealth, this is where things get shaky. The unprepared response is to sell down shares or managed funds at whatever price they're sitting at that week, just to cover a surprise expense like a hot water system or a bathroom repair. Selling into a flat or falling market to cover a bill is one of the most expensive habits in retirement because you're locking in a loss you didn't need to take. The alternative is having what's sometimes called a cash bucket, roughly 2 years of essential spending, around $60,000 for a lot of retirees, sitting somewhere boring and stable. When a bad year hits, you draw from that bucket instead of your investments, and you let the market recover before you touch it again. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but the difference between selling shares at the bottom and waiting 2 years for them to recover can be tens of thousands of dollars over a retirement. I remember talking with a bloke in Geelong who had a genuinely beautiful home, paid off, well kept, and who was skipping dental appointments to save money. That's not what wealth is supposed to feel like. That's closer to a hostage situation than a retirement. So how do you actually move from that position, house rich and quietly rationing yourself, to someone who's a homeowner with real cash sitting on hand? There are 3 concrete steps you can start working through, and none of them require selling the home you love. Step 1 is the audit. Add up your super, your cash, and any shares outside super, then subtract every debt you're still carrying. Leave the house out of this calculation entirely. That number, not your total net worth, is your real starting point. Step 2 is the catch-up. From a fund's July 2026, the concessional contributions cap sits at $32,500 a year. If you've got savings sitting outside super, moving them in through this cap shifts them into a lower tax environment. And if your total super balance is under $500,000, you may be able to use unused cap space from previous years as well. Step 3 is the equity lever. If you're over 55 and thinking about a smaller home eventually, the Downsizer contribution lets each partner add up to $300,000 from the sale into super on top of the normal caps. It's worth researching properly before you decide whether or when to use it. As a simple target, aim for a liquidity ratio, your liquid net worth divided by your total net worth, of at least 40% before you pull the trigger on retirement. Below that, you're more exposed than the headline number suggests, and it's worth working through these 3 steps properly before you set a retirement date, rather than after. That $1,601,000 median figure was never meant to be your finish line. It's a starting point, and the real goal is turning equity that's sitting still into income you can actually spend. If your own super balance looks smaller than the total net worth figures you see quoted online, that doesn't mean you're behind. It means you've got a liquidity puzzle in front of you, one with a handful of well-understood tools already built to solve it. Work out your real liquid number, use the caps and schemes available to you, and stop measuring yourself against a figure that was only ever describing a house, not a retirement. Whatever number you land on, it's a starting point you can actually work with, not a verdict on the decisions you've already made. Subscribe to Aussie Retirement with Bob, and let's keep getting your money out of the bricks and into your pocket.